Good day, everybody. Welcome to the Queen's University Center for International Defense Policy Lunchtime Speaker Series. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Major and Dr. Christian Breed. Christian is a senior staff officer at the Canadian Defence Academy's Professional Concepts and Leader Development Team. In addition to this, he is a visiting professor at Simon Fraser University's Terrorism Risk and Security Studies program and an adjunct professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, where he supervises research projects on security policy analysis. Christian holds a PhD in War Studies from RMC and has published on the topics of foreign and security policy with a research focus on societal cohesion, military culture, and technology. He has almost 25 years of military experience, including deployments with the Canadian Army in Haiti and Afghanistan. Today is here to present his thoughts on renewing the profession of arms, cultural renovation for the Canadian Armed Forces. I would like to welcome, on all our behalves, Christian Breed.
Hello, everyone. Right, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. It should look good, I think. Yeah, so Howard, thank you so much for that introduction. I just want to clarify it's a small detail. I'm the Senior Staff Officer 2, which means that I am just a member of the team. My boss is the Senior Staff Officer. It's Bill Cummings, and I saw that he's on the line here watching too. So I just want to make sure that's clear, that I don't presume to be taking over his team, which is not at all what's happening. But it is a pleasure to be here, and it's kind of feels a little bit like coming home, although in a remote capacity. The CIDP's always got a special place in my heart, and it's a great organization. I'm thrilled to be able to come and talk about this really important topic with everyone here again today. So this is what we're going to talk about, and I use the term renovation on purpose and with intention, and we'll see in a second what that's all about. But first, of course, is the disclaimer, which is, as it says here in my little Comic Sans font, we're discussing policy and official efforts, but unless I explicitly cite those policies or doctrine, what we're discussing here really are my views and indeed hopes for where we could go, but not at all official policy of the Canadian Armed Forces, Department of National Defense, or the Government of Canada. You know the deal, the pretty standard boilerplate disclaimer. But let's get into it. The Canadian Armed Forces, no surprise, given the media attention we've had over the last few years, in fact, is in a real state of crisis. There's a significant challenge we're facing. It's what scholars will call the heritage identity, or the heritage culture of the Canadian Armed Forces, is really being challenged and questioned, and for good reason. It's come under an intense amount of scrutiny, as these few media snippets that you see here in front of you suggest, and primarily revolving around the idea of sexual misconduct. But this has revealed, as they've dug deeper, broader issues within what constitutes the profession of arms in Canada, beyond just simply sexual misconduct. And what's really frustrating is that this has persisted for over 30 years. Indeed, nothing seems to be changing despite the repeated external reviews and reports, and indeed efforts of the past to really fix this in a fulsome way. And again, you see a selection of documents from over the last 30 years that really shows how challenging this has been, most notably Charlotte Duval-Lantoine's latest book, The Ones We Let Down, which is a really difficult read, but incredibly important in that it really sets the record and establishes the record in one single volume of the challenges that we face with respect to specifically gender integration and our failures on that front over the last 30 years. And of course, all of this is within the context of a degrading security environment, whether we're talking economically, environmentally, or in fact, traditional security concerns, as well as the changing systemic order of international relations with a rising China, a spoiling Russia, and a United States that's trying to maintain the status quo as well. So we see a lot of challenges facing what is essentially the profession of arms, and what is the defense and security of Canada in a very broad sense. And we're not prepared for it, which is sort of the final piece of the challenge. We're in trouble. But this also provides an opportunity, I think, which is really important, that we, if we don't address these cultural shortfalls, we're going to be in some significant problems. But then that urgency, I think, gives us an opportunity to really make some lasting changes that will set us up to be successful going forward. And it is, in fact, a chance to renovate our culture. And I promised you I'd tell you why this term is being used with such intention. And I really do like this approach, this idea of cultural renovation as opposed to, say, change, because I find it's a more inclusive concept. When a company needs to address problematic cultures and subcultures, like the Canadian Armed Forces. And it comes from this book by Kevin Oakes. And like the word renovation itself implies, it's not a complete teardown, but rather it's fixing what's broken while also keeping what works. And it's inclusive because it gives a role for everyone in the organization who wants to be part of the solution. And it's really challenging when we talk about things like changing culture, because of course the organization is a living, breathing organization that has people in it that have been part of that culture that we now deemed as problematic. And so how do we bring them along as well? How do we show that people can be in uniform and be part of the solution as well? And so this, of course, this idea of renovation as opposed to change allows us greater buy-in for the project. All CAF members currently serving and into the future need to have an opportunity to see themselves in this renovated culture of the Canadian Armed Forces. And yeah, we're trying to thread one heck of a needle, as you can probably imagine, but we need to definitely try. So in practical terms, what does culture renovation mean for the Canadian Armed Forces? Well, it means acknowledging where we've fallen short. And that's a really key, important first step. We as an institution and as select individuals have broken trust with our members. We've let them down, and we've let our fellow Canadians down. We need to rebuild trust, and that starts with acknowledging what we've done wrong. But it also means that we recognize what's working, and that what is core to our profession as an institution, in this case, the profession of arms, that we need to retain as part of this renovation process as well. So we want to make sure that we change the right things, but keep the things that are working as well. And there are things that are working. And so this combination of acknowledgement and recognition will be able to garner the broadest buy-in possible for our renovation efforts. And so those who are part of our heritage identity within the Canadian Armed Forces need to see themselves in our renovated culture. And those who felt unwelcome as part of this heritage identity of the Canadian Armed Forces need to see themselves in our renovated culture. And those who are considering joining the Canadian Armed Forces also need to see themselves in this new renovated culture. And so it comes to building a sense of inclusion through belonging, not simply just another form of exclusion. So how are we doing this? Well, our first step in this process is to bring character back in. Well, why character? Well, interestingly enough, it's actually one of the 5 criteria for service within the Canadian Armed Forces according to the King's Regulations and Orders. And it's also the one, if you look here on this screenshot from the KRNOs and the section 6.01, it's the one that's also the most nebulous, most difficult to define. You know, it says here, we need to be of good character. So what does that mean? Well, research suggests that organizational culture and individual behavior shortfalls are in fact deficiencies of character. And it's important, and it needs to be maintained, just like physical fitness. So what does character mean? Well, it's the mental and moral qualities distinctive to an individual, as one definition suggests, this one offered by Mary Crowson. And for us, we're examining and incorporating elements of Crowson's work, her character leader model from 2017, which is itself the product of decades of research within the research program known as positive psychology. And what's interesting as well is you'll see here that this has a decidedly, and in fact deliberate, individual focus. We're looking at people. So again, what do we mean by character? Well, here's the model, and this is a little overwhelming at first glance, but as you take the time to look it through, it makes a tremendous amount of sense, and it's really quite actually intuitive. And this is what Crossan and her colleagues propose. We see here that judgment is the central feature around which 10 additional attributes relate to. All of them are, in fact, different components of character. And it's this model that became the theoretical foundation for cultural renovation efforts. And what's interesting is, of course, each of these individual attributes have little sliders on them, if you will. You can see each of them as either being stronger or weaker, depending on the individual. And everyone has different combinations of these attributes in terms of strengths and weaknesses. Some people may have more drive than others. Others may have more collaboration impulses than others. Others may have a higher sense of humanity, humility, integrity, etc. They're all going to vary from person to person. But it's in the aggregate that we start to see whether someone has strong character or not. But what this helps with doing is, if we say character is important, by focusing on these particular attributes, we can start to see ways in which we can influence the increase in strength of these different attributes in a meaningful way that will then help with judgment and build this idea of strong character. Someone of weak character would be someone where most of these attributes are either weak or non-existent. Strong character would be the opposite. but it ultimately means that we have a path to strengthen individuals' character. We can train for it. And so as a result of these deliberations and consultations, we released this document here just about a year ago. And by say we, I mean PCLD, and really it was led by Bill Cummings' team at the Canadian Defence Academy prior to my joining the team. But this has been widely regarded as a really excellent piece of doctrinal writing, and forcing some really interesting discussions as well. And so this document was released, and it's continuing to be rolled out as we speak into the Canadian Armed Forces at large, which emphasizes the importance of character and introduces some basic ideas for what this means. And so far, it seems that it's been really well received and considered, like I said, a great piece of work. It's short, at only about 60 pages. It's written clearly in engaging language, and it's practical. And so by looking at the ethos, it focuses on 3 areas. It focuses on the importance that trust plays within our profession and how it connects with Canadian society. And then this renewed and expanded Canadian Armed Forces ethos now moves from 9 elements to 21 elements. And so we have an additional 12 elements. So it seems like a long list of things, but as you'll see as we move through it, it's actually really quite accessible and, again, intuitive. Leaders and have professional responsibilities to best exemplify, uphold, and socialize the ethos across the Canadian Armed Forces. This is another big part of emphasis, or area of emphasis, within this book. So the main takeaway from Trusted to Serve, the Canadian Armed Forces ethos, is the articulation of the role of character in the establishment of trust with our members. And as you can see here in big, bold red text, we see that character and competence is what's required to generate trust. It's a simple little formula. But let's go a bit deeper. What exactly are we talking about here? This model for trust comes from a blend of Stephen Covey's The Speed of Trust, a model that was introduced decades ago, as well as the work by University of Western Ontario's Ivey School of Business, led, no surprise, by Mary Crossan and her team. And it's these 2 elements that have really helped us understand the role of character in the development of trust. And for certain, character, competence, and commitment are all equally important. But if you look at the formula, you can see that if your commitment is 0, neither character nor competence really matters. And again, this idea of working and putting in that effort, and the combination of competence and character is what's important. So the other part that's really important to understand here is this idea of a living commitment to principled set of behaviors. And our ability to defend Canada, that is our professional competence, is not in question. That's not what we're looking at. It's our character that's been called into question. And character, as we said, is a difficult concept to unpack. Character is one of those terms that everyone references, but few take the time to fully understand. And from an ethos perspective, character is a living commitment to a principled set of behaviors underpinned by values that bring credit to our profession. And from an ethos perspective, character is also about you as a person, not what you do as an occupation. We know that people are our most valuable resource, and we are significantly short of personnel right now, about almost 10,000 as of last count. And so it makes sense that the quality of our people is critically important, and hence character is critically important as well. The book covers, all told, 3 ethical principles, 6 military values, and 8 professional expectations that we hope and, in fact, expect all of our members of the Canadian Armed Forces to embody. And this is how we plan to bring character back into the Canadian Armed Forces. So a second effort that we're trying to do, of course, is this idea of socialization. While much of what was written in Duty with Honor, and in fact, previous attempts at righting the ship, so to speak, within the Canadian Armed Forces with respect to its military culture and the profession of arms more generally, has not been a failure of ideas, but more of a failure of socialization. And so we're trying to fix that with this approach here. We're looking for semi-structured discussions that are led by the chain of command, ideally in some sort of a formal, semi-formal session about 3 or 4 times a year. We're looking at introducing podcasts to propel the discussion that way and add to the public discourse as well as the discourse within the Canadian Armed Forces itself, and become a resource that leaders can draw on. We're looking at doing some gamification through dilemma games and whatnot. And as well, we're looking at content creation just in general to help unit level facilitated discussions. But at the end of the day, the primary source of this socialization is the leadership. You see here we have images of discussions in mess halls and group discussions. Is how do we get our ideas from Trusted to Serve to start influencing these discussions and start becoming the topic of these discussions that are happening around the mess hall, in the dining halls, in the pubs. I think back to my own experience as an infantry officer. I know where I was socialized. It was in the pub in Fredericton called the Snooty Fox with some of my fellow junior officers. How do we get these ideas into those conversations? That's the trick. And that's the effort, one of the main socialization efforts we're pursuing right now. But it has to be guided and driven by the leadership of the organization. Indeed, leadership and culture feed off each other to create the profession of arms that we all want. And the establishment and maintenance of a culture is a leadership function. So we start to see how the profession of arms, as this is the intersection between that culture and leadership. Leaders at all levels need to talk to their teams on a regular basis about these issues. These leaders at all levels need to model it for their teams at all times. It really is a leadership function. And lastly, the last component that we're looking at is this idea of socialization being about buy-in. It's about all members of the CAF doing their part. Indeed, the Chief of Defense Staff recently noted regarding our ethos that all members of the Canadian Armed Forces need to weave it into the fabric of our lives. And these are really powerful endorsement from our senior serving officer. We all have to do our part. And it's not about mandatory training sessions, annual briefings, or tick in the box online courses. It's about really living and driving the discussion by leaders and having and engaging in those discussions as members of the team overall. So in terms of what's next for our efforts, it will go far broader than just socializing Trusted to Serve. Indeed, the renovation of our culture will be an ongoing process. It's a process that really doesn't stop. Our immediate next steps include the following, one of which we're really excited about is an Indigenous Perspectives on the Profession of Arms workshop that we're looking to hold again through the Center for International Defense Policy in mid-June of 2023. We're looking to get that Indigenous voice in terms of what a renovated profession of arms culture looks like. We want to do a deeper dive through a combination of intellectual engagement and restatement of doctrine of our capstone, or what's known as BOSS text, of the Profession of Arms manual. This new manual that will ultimately replace Duty with Honor alongside and sit alongside Trusted to Serve is tentatively titled The Fighting Spirit. This is currently in production right now. And this will be aimed at our PME institutions, so professional military education institutions, and serve as the foundation for discussions and reflection of the profession of arms in Canada within the schoolhouses and training institutions across Canada and across the Canadian Armed Forces. And this is where the project that I'm leading right now. An intermediate next step includes leadership doctrine review. And longer term, we're looking to renew the CDA press to help steward our renovated profession of arms and continue to stimulate the Canadian Armed Forces and the broader defense and security community in Canada on these topics and debates. Again, I can't emphasize enough that this idea of culture and a renovation of a culture is an ongoing process. It requires constant attention, constant reflection, and a constant line of effort to make sure that we get the culture we want and that Canadians deserve. So while probably pretty fast and furious, this is sort of an update in terms of what we're doing and sort of how I see things going with respect to the profession of arms in Canada and it's our culture renovation efforts therein. Feel free to contact me anytime at these two coordinates that you see here. And I'd be happy to talk more, answer any questions, or continue this discussion elsewhere as well. Howard.
Thank you very much, Christian. Just to let everybody know, there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions, and a couple of people have already taken advantage of that, please feel free to put them in the box. Christian, I'll start off. We were, just for the benefit of the audience, we were having a discussion about toxic masculinity prior to the commencement of our presentation today, and then that broadened out to the idea of feminine masculine traits and how do they fit within CAF culture. So and I asked Christian to consider that and if he could speak to that after the presentation. So I'm going to call on him now to discuss the shifting role of traits in CAF culture. And where does that kind of, after listening to your presentation, where does that fit into your model?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the question, Howard. It's awesome. So there's a couple ways to answer this. One is I want to acknowledge there's a ton of literature on the topic of toxic masculinity and militarized masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, if anyone's interested. And I'm probably not going to do any of it justice in my answer. But I will give a couple shout outs to it. And one that's important to note is Bibi Imre-Mille and Steffi von Hacke recently published a piece in the Canadian Military Journal on this very topic, which I thought was really, really interesting in terms of really framing not just how toxic masculinity harms marginalized groups and women in particular across the Canadian Armed Forces, but it actually harms everyone because it creates false roles with respect to things like work-life balance, which is the focus of the article by Imre Millet and Van Lackey. And so that's sort of the context in which I take this answer is it affects us all. It's not just an issue about men or women. It really affects us all. And because of that, the answer and sort of the ideal model, if you will, of what it means, what masculinity means is it's both. It's a blend. It's an integration. Healthy masculinity is integrated with feminine and masculine traits. Everybody has both. And then it's the idea of the integration of it that really leads to something that's mature and healthy. When we start to see things like toxic masculinity emerge, it's because there's an imbalance. There's too much of those masculine energies and at the expense of the feminine. And a lot of those sort of toxic traits that we see, power over, othering, things like that. One observer called it boy energy. You sort of think of a 10, 15-year-old kid on the schoolyard. That's the embodiment of toxic masculinity. And ideally, as these folks grow, as they mature, you bring in that integration. So that's sort of how I see it. So in terms of how that applies to the Canadian Armed Forces, we need to shed some of these ideals, identities of what it means to be a member of the Canadian Armed Forces. So much of our identity, and I go back to this idea of the heritage identity. The heritage identity of the Canadian Armed Forces is it's a white male heterosexual space. And we can be so much more than that. And not just because it's inclusive and the right thing to do, but because it's fair to everyone that's serving. Why impose a particular form of identity on people that seems at root ultimately rather arbitrary? What is it about the white male heterosexual person that makes them the best soldier, right? There's nothing there to say that that's the case. So why do we do this, right? Well, there's all sorts of historical and social reasons for that, but that doesn't mean that that's how it has to be going forward. And so I think this is like I said before at the outset, this is a real opportunity for us to create a genuinely inclusive organization that will be effective at defending Canadian interests, but also a place that every Canadian and every person that wants to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces can see themselves in.
Thanks very much, Christian. I have there's a question from David Last that I think you've partially answered, but I'll highlight it because I think it serves to underline some of the confusion. David underlined some of the confusion out there about doctrinal publications. Can you talk about the connection between trusted to serve and duty with honor? Mm-hmm. And there is an impression that trusted to serve replaces duty with honor, but is that true?
So eventually what's going to happen is you'll see trusted to serve. We're in a transition period, bottom line, right? So the original plan, and hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn here, but the original plan was to see trusted to serve replace duty with honor wholesale. As we went through this process, and I'll happily let Bill jump in on this one if he wants to. It was seen as, while a great document, it wasn't enough. We need to do more. If we're going to really replace duty with honor, it's going to take more than a 60-page pamphlet that gets desk dropped on every soldier's workspace. So we need to do more. And so that's the process we're undergoing right now, is to update and renew the Profession of Arms Manual, which is duty with honor, with this new volume that we're calling The Fighting Spirit. And again, like I want to stress, that's tentative. It's a working title. We'll see if it sees through to the end when this thing's finally published. We've got an aggressive publication schedule, but also a really interesting and innovative review process that we're trying to undergo to really get this thing out and again, reflective of all the, like I said, is that threading of the needle, right? We want to make sure we capture all the different dimensions of what constitute Canadian society to make sure that they are reflected in what we're trying to do. So the answer is it's yes, it does, but it's a slow process, right? We can't just simply replace it overnight. So right now, duty with honor is still out there, and a lot of what's going to be in the Fighting Spirit is going to echo what's in duty with honor. We're just doing it in a different way. There's really nothing that's being said that's going to be removed. We're simply adding to it. I think we're just going to expand on some ideas.
Okay, well, thank you. That you make it sound so straightforward. The Marshall Gerbrandt asked, I should say, what is the minimum threshold of acceptable character? Given the issues with CAF recruitment and retention, how do the ideas within Trusted to Serve contribute to the CAF determining who should or should not be allowed to remain within the profession of arms?
Okay. So first and foremost, if you look at the back of Trusted to Serve, there's the behavior matrix. And you'll see there's a set of behaviors that we've articulated that fall above this proverbial line. If you want to think of what that minimum expectation is, it's that line. And so every individual is going to have a different composition of those 10 attributes according to Crossan's work. So we're not going to say that if you're deficient in these 3, you're out, but it's that aggregate, right? So how, and different weaknesses in character in some places can be offset by strengths of character in other places, right? So it's really hard to sort of say, these different attributes at these different levels are required, because again, we can't really measure that except through behavior. And so like I said, at the back of Trusted to Serve is that behavior matrix, and you'll see in there behaviors that are acceptable, that are above the line, and behaviors that are unacceptable that are below the line. And that's really the model. That's the guide going forward. And then all the ancillary material, the podcast, the dilemma games, the what's going to happen, what's going to be in the fighting spirit. These are all additional material that can help you think through some of these problems. One of the things that I find really interesting, having now worked in this space for a while, is answers aren't clear. And if you're looking for a simple answer for how to behave, it boils down to it isn't simple. There's judgment. It's a judgment call. And while we can say this is how it ought to be, at the end of the day, when someone is faced with those decisions, and we're talking about ethical dilemmas, what have you, it really comes down to their personal decisions that they make, and whether or not that's in keeping with their own personal values as well as the values of the institution. Ideally, they align, but sometimes they don't, and that's where we seem to have a lot of problems. And sometimes you don't know that until that instant happens, where you're sort of faced with that, the gravity of that decision.
Thank you.
That answers the question, Marshall, but hopefully.
Yeah, I was just thinking it was a big question to answer, but I think you did a workmanlike job of dealing with it. And I've got another tough one for you. It's from Mark Popov. Hi, Mark. I think the Army's regimental system has contributed to the current CAF cultural problem. Bro dudes, and they're in quotes, are being pushed despite leadership failings and good people sidelined. How do you see personnel management, particularly the assessment function, leading to selection, promotion, advancement in the quote renovated CAF culture, end quote? Can we look at performance and honestly assess who should lead or command or advance honestly based on performance that adds institutional value and can lead even in combat fights based on hockey or running performance? Now that might have included me at one point.
Yeah, so Mark, you've struck a nerve with me for sure. One, I didn't play any hockey, so right away I was never going to be a CO in the battalion. No, but I joke, but I don't. Right, like I feel the pain. I really do. And one of the things that got me really excited about this project was the socialization effort. And by socialization, I talked a little bit about it in this presentation, but for this to really have the impact it's going to have, it will influence everything across the Canadian Armed Forces. That's why we're looking at the fighting spirit being the new boss text, right? And so from the literature on doctrine and hierarchy of doctrine, every military will have a boss text, which is kind of the capstone doctrine that from everything else falls out. So if we use this book properly, this will influence how we do talent management, how we do talent acquisition within the Canadian Armed Forces. It should, right? So it should have its tendrils out into all areas of the Canadian Armed Forces, including performance reviews and including MilPers command and including the regimental system. And the regimental system is going to have to adjust, and that's the intent. Is we'll see, if we're to see it continue, there's some adjustments that will have to be made for sure if this is done right. Like I said, it's going to be really challenging. And it's going to take more than just our little team at PCLD to do this. It's going to take that buy-in that we need from everybody. It's why we're trying to consult as broadly as we are, which is an incredibly painful process, but it is important that everybody around the table has a voice in creating this new boss text, and so that we can be honest and open with how we want to proceed. But ideally, yes, this is going to influence how we do everything in the Canadian Armed Forces, not just in terms of addressing sexual misconduct, but really looking at how we manage talent, which is what this comes down to. Mark, I don't know if that answers your question, but great one.
Yeah, Mark posed a very tough question, because the pervasiveness of the regimental and even branch system within the Army, for sure,
Yeah.
really predetermines promotion and selection and promotion,
Yeah, it does.
particularly at senior levels, and that will, any changes to that system are going to require huge amounts of energy and
Yeah.
and persistence to keep the change in place. Just
Yeah.
speaking. So
Oh, Howard, I fully agree with you. And I just honestly, I am being a little careful with what I say, and I have my personal views on it. I think there's definitely some things that need to change. And it's a horrible way to run a system sometimes. You know,
yeah,
some of the stories we hear, like there, you shake your head and you're like, what are we doing?
yeah.
You know, and ultimately we can do better. Like we really can.
Well, I was honestly, I was just thinking now that you're not getting an easy ride with these questions today.
Okay.
So I've got one from Brian Cox, sorry, Brian, and welcome to Brian. One central requirement for cultural renovation and change, you correctly identified, is to acknowledge what aspects of D&D CAF culture need to be improved. However, prevailing impressions of current or past culture are based largely on sources such as external reviews or media coverage with questionable methods. I'm just going to say methods, with questionable methods. What steps can be taken to develop a qualitatively and quantitatively sound impression of the actual state of CAF culture? If we do not currently have a sound methods impression of cultural challenges, how are we to assess the effectiveness of current and emerging solutions that are proposed to renovate D&D CAF culture? And as a pitch, I will say that Brian recently wrote a policy paper on the Arbor report. So I'll just put that
Okay.
out there as well.
Yeah. No, and I that's a good question too. In that, you know, we need to understand the challenge we're facing if we're going to try to fix it. And I think there's definitely some, you know, I feel the pain, right? Folks that have been in this organization, have devoted their life to this organization, then to see it challenged in the way that it has, that can be really difficult. That can be really painful. What I will say is, despite some of the methodological challenges that there might be in some of these external reports, there's a lot of data there that suggests, alongside these reports, that there's a real problem, and it's pretty hard to debate. Our retention issues, our recruiting issues, our operational effectiveness challenges in certain areas, the continuous stream of testimonies and of people coming forward and saying this happened to me. We can't ignore that, and even if it's overemphasized by a factor or by an order of magnitude, whatever, it's irrelevant. If this is happening in our military, it's got to stop, and we got to do something. We got to do better. So yeah, we could sit and debate some of the methods, I think, and to a point that's useful. But at the end of the day, these things happened. And we end up then getting caught up in debates of degree as opposed to the debates in kind. And really, these things happened, and whether they happen to the extent that some are saying or not, ultimately, I think is irrelevant. What matters is these things happen to individuals that put the uniform on, and they deserve better, and they deserve to be seen, heard, and valued. And by value, that means we change things and we make this place a better organization to serve in.
Thank you, Christian. We have a excellent question from Colonel Ryan Drakowski, our Canadian visiting defense fellow at Queen's. Thanks for the discussion, Christian. Great that you're framing this as renovation. Fairly simple question. Are senior military and political leaders also framing it in this way? Is this language in our emerging doctrine?
Sir, to be honest, no, not yet. We're trying. We're pushing it up. It's what we're using within CDA. It's what we're using within PCLD. Obviously, you know, CPCC has not fully got on with this one, but I think that's just because it's just going to take time. And so this is what we're pushing, and we're hoping through the fighting spirit in particular, where this is sort of front and center as the framework through which we're trying to do what we're doing, that we can start to change things. It's going to take time. We've only been at this for we've been at this for less than a year, so I'm hopeful that this will get the traction that we want. But like you can probably imagine with any doctrinal concept, it's a challenging thing in and of itself to get that across. But no, it hasn't been bought into at the highest of levels, although we have briefed it this way to certain levels of command, such as I believe up to the CDS, I think has been briefed in this language. I'm pretty sure we did.
I have a question from Alan Whitehorn. Have social media, such as internet websites, made D&D resocialization more difficult? And that's a great question, Alan, because every time, particularly a few months ago, as I was looking at my Twitter feed, I felt for the CDS every day. So over to you, Christian.
Yeah, so social media is one of those great new phenomena that, it is the quintessential double-edged sword. It levels the playing field, allows everyone to be a content creator, allows everybody to have a voice, but it allows everyone to have a voice, which can sometimes lead to problems. And so, yeah, I think as it makes our life challenging in terms of things get amplified that maybe ought not to be, and things get blown out of proportion that maybe not ought to be, but it also gives a voice to folks that otherwise wouldn't have the ability to get their ideas out there. So I think it's like the air we breathe now. It's something we have to, it is there, it is something we need. It's something we can't get rid of, and we have to learn how to navigate it and work through it. And I think all of us need to start thinking about how we engage with social media. This is something I talked to my students about before I left RMC, especially leading up to the last election. The sort of think before you click kind of mantra. We all need to, it's forcing us hopefully in the long run to become better digital citizens and start thinking more deliberately about what it is that we post, what is that we forward, and what it is that we comment on. And that's a whole other form of culture renovation, if you will, at a societal level in terms of how we navigate this stuff. Again, social media has only been around for, in force for the last sort of decade or so. So we're still learning what this is all about. But I think it's something that is indeed a double-edged sword that both harms and enables the things that we're trying to do.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to Alan's question, and it's I'm just trying to word it in a way that won't put it in.
That means I didn't answer it, is what you're saying, Howard.
No, I'm not saying that, but what I am saying. So do you perceive that social media influencers have had an impact on the shape of cultural renewment in the CF?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think more was it. I'm gonna give a shout out to Bill again. He put this really beautifully, especially as I'm listening to the feedback we're getting on the fighting spirit. Feedback's a gift, right? The fact that someone chose to engage with our discussion, with our topic, is amazing. It's up to us to figure out what we're going to do with it, and how much weight we give it, how much salience we give it, how much attention we give it. But the fact that someone's engaging with our ideas is fantastic. And I think as long as we keep it at that level and not take it too personally, and understand what it's contributing and understand the value of the feedback, I think we're in good position. And for every social media influencer that perhaps is coming at this with malign intent or less than helpful, less than constructive intent, we've got many who come forward genuinely wanting to make the institution better. And I think we should welcome it.
Okay. Erin Y poses a interesting question. I'm going to preface up front by saying she's talking about militarism. Okay. So can you speak about these attempts at cultural change to be more inclusive, anti-toxic masculinity, reimagining of the warrior, that could still in the end camouflage or reinforce militarism, militarization, and militarist mentalities?
Yeah, one way is that we don't go deep enough in terms of the actual renovation we're doing. If we just keep this at the surface level and don't take what we're trying to do seriously and actually implement the changes and actually live and breathe. For example, the ethos is, this is the Chief of Defense Staff's own words. We need to live and breathe this ethos every day. If we don't do that, yeah, then nothing's going to change. And the militarism, if that's what we're looking to fix, if that's the issue, then that will persist. If we don't really dig into this change and take it on as our own, whether that new change will simply perpetuate militaristic challenges. Not entirely sure, and I think maybe I need a better definition of what militarism means in your context. If you're meaning like sort of the Jamie Swift, Ian MacKay idea of the warrior nation and Canada becoming all about war, and that's sort of how we see ourselves. I think that's one perspective. I think there's more to Canada than just that. I don't think that's fully accurate, and I think it's a bit of a selective reading of the history. Although there's elements there that we need to be aware of for sure, and there's elements there specifically around the warrior that I'm particularly concerned of within the Canadian Armed Forces. And again, our efforts at PCLD in particular are to try to right that ship. Certainly the way the warrior is cast right now and popularly understood, it's not what we want in our soldiers. There are elements of the warrior for sure that I think are really laudable, but then let's say that, we want a fighting spirit. We want that tenacity. We want that grit. We want that ability to dig in and work hard. But then if that's what we want, let's say that, right? Let's be specific. This is what Chris Ankerson argued about years ago when he was talking about the challenges of the warrior identity, so we need to be precise, and which of course takes more time and takes more effort.
Joel Sikowski, hi Joel, has a question for you. Are there plans to communicate these revisions and changes to the public in order to restore public confidence in the Canadian Armed Forces and especially its senior leadership?
That's certainly one of my secondary objectives, is that our audience, while primarily is students in our PME institutions, I also would love to see these ideas permeate out into the Canadian public for that very reason. That trust has absolutely been breached within our own membership, but has also been breached with Canadians at large, and that needs to be rebuilt too. So absolutely.
Craig Jones asks, which military organization has the optimal operational culture from which Canada could learn? So I think Craig is asking this for other countries, not so much internally.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of really interesting elements from different countries around the world, but they're all difficult to replicate in Canada. And so one that I think is really interesting, for example, is the way in which the New Zealand Defence Force has integrated their own Indigenous identity into their military. I think that's fantastic. I think it comes across as authentic. It comes across as inclusive. It comes across as a capability booster. But we couldn't replicate that in Canada. Primarily because we have 600 and some First Nations, half dozen Métis, and then another few dozen Inuit communities and nations that comprise Canada, right? So which one do we pick? How do we thread that needle? And that's what we're hoping will come out in the Indigenous Perspectives workshop that we're doing in June, is get some insights on how we can do something like that. But to take that and replicate it in Canada, as was done in New Zealand, is too difficult. Our situation is far more complex. I think what it comes down to in terms of what country gets it right, I don't really know, other than that there's some that seem to be effective. The Israelis do interesting things, but that has its own unique context and challenges as well in terms of their own military culture and their professional ethic. And it's not, so no one I think gets this absolutely right. And I think the key is to do something that's right for Canada. And that's the trick, is our context is unique, as is just about every other country around the world. And so we need to look around and figure out what is it that's done well that applies to Canada, and what's the stuff that's done well that doesn't. And so we don't try to replicate something that's not possible. But I think the real key is to create something that is uniquely Canadian. And so there's limited utility in looking at how other countries have done it. What might be instructive, and I think we're working on this to an extent, is the processes that different countries have used to effect a positive change. And but I think, again, whether we're talking militaries or any large scale organization, there's lots of lessons out there on how to do cultural renovation, which again is why I sort of latched on to Kevin Oakes's work, because he's a world leader and industry leader on doing exactly what we're trying to do in the Canadian Armed Forces with massive organizations that are in some cases far larger than ours.
I think it might be early in stages for this question, but I'm going to ask this from one of our students at RMC, Cameron Donaldson. Mm-hmm. He says, "Good day, sir. With regards to recruiting based on character, what are some of the measures that can be used to screen for an applicant's character prior to their acceptance in the Canadian Armed Forces?" It's a good question.
Yeah. No, if you recall back to your own time getting recruited, right? There are certain techniques we use to do that. Whether it's the interview, there's I think there's a personality test that's administered now. I don't think we had to do that, Howard, but they do it now. And so there's little things that we do to sort of screen for it. But ultimately, yeah, this is something that's going to have to start to be integrated. Like again, we talked earlier in one of the answers to the previous questions about how if this is done right, this will influence all areas of the Canadian Armed Forces, and like I said, to include talent acquisition, which is recruiting. And so we have to take another look at how we do recruiting to make sure that we are in fact recruiting for character, as Section 6 of the KRNOs says we need to be.
That was a pretty fulsome answer. I was actually thinking about when I read the question that it was yet another one that was challenging the answer, because, and I'm sure you're getting many questions like this every day. I've got one from Dan Doran, and he reminds me of that old catchphrase, some call it abuse, others call it training. So one of the old arguments for past practices that by today's standards would be considered abusive was that they developed resilience in soldiers and leaders. In a modern military that still needs leaders and soldiers who are resilient, how do we achieve this without leaving residual trauma? Can combat resilience be developed without risking trauma? Certainly, given that trauma unavoidably manifests itself through combat.
Yeah. So first off, Dan, great to see you again. I know we can't chat in real time right now, but awesome that you joined this. And I don't think I've seen you in, gosh, almost 20 years, and I've been following you on LinkedIn and stuff like that. We went to school together at the Royal Military College, and so thanks for joining. In terms of resilience, I think again it's threading a needle. And I keep going back to this analogy of threading a needle because we can get this wrong by going too far. There is stress in training that's useful. And I think back to my own experience as a young officer cadet going through phase training in the infantry. I saw all and was experienced all manner of stuff that was not really abuse, but it was abusive to a point, and it was probably unnecessary. But there was also some really good hard training and iterations and evolutions that we had to do that were good. And we're done with the right spirit, with the right intent of building toughness, building resilience. And it was hard, and I hated it, but it was good and it was valuable. And I think back, actually, the late Larry Sanford was one of my instructors on phase 2. And one of the things I admired about that gentleman so much was his ability to make life difficult for us, to build resilience in a way that didn't come across as abusive. There's a way to do it, and going for one of the things that I remember he did with us on phase 2 was we did a patrol, the 5 of us at like 3 a.m, and went out for 2 hours, far farther than anyone else had to, and that sucked, right? But then we got some sleep, and he woke us up a little bit later so that we came up rested, and then we carried on with the rest of the platoon's activities. The other sections in our platoon did other hardness training or whatever you had to build resilience. That was all it was silly, and it was kind of abusive, but he took us away from that and just put us on a patrol, and we learned patrol craft and learned how to stay awake, and some tips and techniques like that. Like that's good training, and I think that's what we need to aim for. And it takes instructors like Larry to have that maturity and that willingness to do it the right way, as opposed to do it the easy way, which is just to make them stand at attention in the rain for 2 hours, right? Like, what does that do for you? Right? It's nothing. Like, it's about designing good training that's difficult. In terms of combat resilience, and I think there's a lot of research that supports this as well, is we don't know what that looks like until the moment that you're actually in combat. It's really hard to prepare for that, and that becomes something that you have to just look in yourself and find. An interesting article I came across as part of the writing was an interview between a native Hawaiian veteran who served in Vietnam and was just recently a senior judge in the state of Hawaii. And he was interviewed by the editor of this book on indigenous ideas of masculinity. And they were talking about the Hawaiian view of the warrior, which is this idea of ku. And it's the sort of colloquially known as the god of war, but it's more than that, right? And there's some 400 Hawaiian deities that comprise their worldview. And he talks about this idea of Ku as being this idea of perseverance, and that it comes from within you, right? Everyone has it. And that the traumatic thing is when you see it come out when you're in combat, it comes out of you, you're like, oh my God, I'm doing things I never thought possible. And then learning how to put that back inside you and learning how to guard against it. And it's a really interesting perspective on this idea of the warrior and what it means to be resilient in combat. Because of course, this guy is saying, I had a cleansing moment. I came back from the war and I went surfing. And for him, that was really a spiritual moment for him, as he reconnected with the god of water. And that sort of cleansed him of what he did. And so he didn't suffer from the PTSD as much. So I think it's just really interesting, these different perspectives on what constitutes resilience is worth diving into, because it's so much more than just beasting people, as we used to say in phase training.
We have a question from Bob Martin, and hi to Bob. And I think you know Bob, so I think you'll like the question. Assuming that sometimes troops can be cynical, how to address the ethos being dismissed out of hand as Op Honor 2.0?
All right, well, I'll give you an equally sort of cynical, if not flippant, reply, which is they got to read the damn thing. And then let's talk. It's not a long read. And if that's what's coming, then I would look at the leadership and say, what are you telling your soldiers? And you need to read this and hoist this aboard, because this is far more than just Op Honor 2.0. This is a genuine call to action for everyone, fundamentally to start doing some inner work, which I think we could all benefit from. And really, that's what this is about. It's far deeper than that. But good question, Bob, because I think that is what's happening. I think there is some resistance, although it's early yet in terms of the rollout. We're still seeing it promulgate its way through the formations and units across the Canadian Armed Forces. But my sort of broad side would be that this, like I said at the outset of this presentation, it's a leadership function, and how the leaders frame this and how the leaders take the material that's in Trusted to Serve and socialize it is going to be critical. This is not, like I said, this is not a series of annual briefings. This is not a series of online courses. This is something that we model every day and that we talk about all the time. And we look for opportunities as leaders to reach out with our soldiers and have those teachable moments and talk to them and say, hey, here's a good way you can show character. Something as simple as owning up to a mistake is a way in which you can show character. And then on the leadership side, not holding that soldier to account, not putting him in the box of this soldier's not got no career now because they admitted that they made one single mistake. This idea of zero defects is really harmful for that. That answer the question, Bob?
I know where Bob's coming from, because we're of a certain age, and you may not have gone through all the efforts in 98 and 99, like SHARP. I'm not sure. Did you do all that?
Yeah, I did SHARP training. It was the first thing I did when I got to basic training in Saint Jean. Okay, so I think Bob's question does come from that, because basically that the way that rolled out in the late 90s, and then again we saw similar things happen with Op Honor in 2005, 2006. So Howard, like when I showed up at Saint Jean, we were introduced to our instructional staff. And with rolling eyes and sarcasm, they said, "Oh, y'all got to go get sharpened now," and then we went off and did SHARP training. And so, right, that's a leadership failure, right? There's no buy-in from the leadership that what we're doing is important. So how the hell are we going to take it on? We're going to look at this and be, this is stupid, right? And then on top of that, the material was pretty suspect in terms of kind of missing the point of what this was all about. But the fact that the leadership dismissed it out of hand like that, just set the tone that was unhelpful, to say the least. And so that's what I mean by it's a leadership function. It's a leadership responsibility.
There's Another interesting question from Paul Broadbent. He says, in the past, there appears to have been a high tolerance of individuals with questionable character remaining in the CAF. What do you envisage as the potential mechanisms for dealing with such individuals in the future? For example, release, rehabilitation that will contribute or support to restoration of the reputation of the CAF with both the government and the wider public.
Yeah. Well, I think we're seeing some of it play out. You know, the pretty steady flow of senior officers being relieved over the last 18 months. I think there's been a bit of a pause, or things have seemed to have settled down a little bit over the last recent months, but we saw that steady flow. But you bring up an interesting point, which is this idea of rehabilitation. Is there a path forward? Is there a way in which people can rehabilitate? Is there a path forward, you know, for, not to make it too much, but, you know, redemption? How do people get back in the path? We're all going to make mistakes, right? Like we just talked about zero defects, or we don't want to create a culture of zero defects. We want to allow people to make mistakes, to take risks. So how do we do that? How do we live that? And people are going to make mistakes. And so what's the difference between a mistake that is redeemable versus one that's perhaps irredeemable? And I think that's something we definitely need to wrestle with. And I'm really hopeful that we do, because I think there are cases where folks can come back. I think, again, it comes back to humility. And this is, again, that idea, it's one of the traits of character according to Crosland's model, right? Are we willing to say, hey, I really screwed up. I need to learn more about this and do better. Interesting example of this in action was just out here in the Maritimes in New Brunswick. About 2 weeks ago, there was a landlord in Moncton who was in the news for all the wrong reasons, because she had put a rider on the tenant agreement saying that any tenant in this building is not allowed to render any sort of aid to homeless people within 2 blocks or within a block of the building or something like that. And it was, of course, rightly seen as something, you know, really cold-hearted and crass. She wrote in the rider that, you know, homeless people are there of their own volition and the government takes care of them anyway. So this was in the media for about a week, and then she issued an apology about, like I said, about a week later. And I thought it was really interesting. And it was a really interesting apology in that she accepted that she said something that was inappropriate, and she accepted that she didn't know what she was talking about, and that she needed to educate herself on the homeless situation in Canada and what it meant and what it means to be homeless in Canada, and that she pledged to do better. Now, that was really interesting. And then lo and behold, nothing in the news since, right? Like it disappears. And it's one of the things I've always wondered. You know, John Vance, our former CDS, if he had stood up when he unveiled Op Honor, if he had stood up in those town halls and said, I've fallen short of this, I've screwed up, I need to do better, how might things have been different over the ensuing 6 or 7 years, right? That would have taken it would have taken a tremendous amount of, you know, political capital, social capital, and humility for him to do that. And that would have been really hard. But I often wonder that sort of ownership out of the gate, what that might have changed for him going forward.
We've had a tremendous amount of questions, and I'm going to be honest with you, Christian, we're not going to get through them all, but
Okay.
we have time, I think, for one last question. And I apologize to all those whose questions I didn't ask. It's just we're at the hard edge of the ending now. This is from Daryl Williams. I like the direction and agree with your presentation. How does mental health injuries fit into the good character matrix, or do they?
Oh, that's awesome. Yes, it does, 100%. So here's how it works. We all have our own set of values, right? And ideally, those values, we are aware of them enough that we start to behave in line with them. And that shows our character, right? We have the humility, the competence, the temperance, all those 10 attributes manifest in a way from our values. When they don't, there's that schism between what we really believe and how we act, that's the root of mental health challenges. That's the root of suffering for people. And it's really interesting when you think about it in that way, because then it's about, you know, acting in keeping with your values. As long as you act in keeping with your values, you're building that resilience, that mental resilience towards mental health. So absolutely, if you are acting in a way that is demonstrating deficient character, that is going to do damage. not just to the people that you're victimizing, but to yourself as well. And there's the absolutely direct link to mental health outcomes and the strength of character and how that matches with your values. One of the greatest sort of resilience tools to this sort of thing, to PTSD in particular, along with what we just talked about in terms of the inner work and the personal work and the individual work, is the leadership piece. And that the soldiers see the leaders as being of good character and see the leaders as being of good judgment. And if you're in those organizations, that in itself is a resilience function against PTSD. You feel like, hey, I'm doing something that's good. And that really helps with sort of squaring the circle of what it is you've been asked to do in the military.
Christian, that ends the formal our Q&A session. I really want to thank you for taking this on and coming to talk to us today. I know it's a difficult and wide-ranging subject. You're in a process of evolution right now, and so everything's still like jello in certain regards. Although I will say that you took the time, and I know Bill is still online, so you took the time, I think, to express what the work that's being done at the Canadian Defence Academy on behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces in a way that made it comprehensible to people like myself, which does count for a lot, because I'm a pretty simple soul at heart. So I thank you for that. I thank you for being here today. And on behalf of the Queen Center for International Defense Policy and its director, Senator Hugh Segal, I want to express our gratitude for you for making a hard topic easy to understand.
Awesome. Thanks, Howard. Then if that's the case, then mission accomplished. I'm thrilled. And,
I'm your grants captain, man. If I can understand it, we're cooking with fire. So everybody, thank you for joining us today and have a great week.
All right. Take care.